All right. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. With the name of God, all merciful, most merciful. We begin, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, wa salatu wa salamu ala ashrafil mursaleen, ala anbiya'i wal mursaleen, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. We begin with the praise and thanks to God, and with peace and blessings upon all of His messengers. Today, welcome to the Al-Quran Society Circle, again, our weekly session. Today, we are honored to have as our guest Dr. Benedict Curler, who is a fellow in religion and economics at the world-famous Institute for Economic Affairs, headquartered in London, UK, but with a national and international global reach. And he will be sharing his thoughts with us on the topic given around the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as Muslims say, about his economic teachings. And yeah, just a very quick introduction. I first came across Dr. Benedict Curler at a seminar at St. Mary's University in Twickenham in southwest London, which is a Catholic university. This was an in-person seminar 10 years ago, 2015, when his first book had just been published. These are two of his major books. And he spoke about the economic teachings of Moses, Jesus, and Prophet Muhammad, or prophets Moses, Jesus, Christ, and Muhammad. And I was just really blown away by what Dr. Benedict said. So his interfaith, his knowledge of theology, but also the religions, but especially the economic aspect. And he mentioned his book then, which had just been published, Early Islam and the Birth of Capitalism, which I went and bought straight away. And it was £25 at the time on Amazon. It is now nearly £40. And perhaps, Dr. Curley, you could explain what's happening with the capitalism there. Because I would have thought the price should have got cheaper, but that shows how much I know about economics. But very excitingly, Dr. Curler has published a second book recently, which he has edited, but written almost half of the articles in here, actually. It's called Faith in Markets, Abrahamic Religions and Economics. So again, those themes, which I heard him speak about 10 years ago, he has expanded on some of them and put them into writing. So without further ado, actually, I shall hand you over to Dr. Curley, and you can speak for as long as you wish. We have just over an hour and a quarter, an hour and 20 minutes. And so however long you wish to speak, for half an hour, 40 minutes, 45 minutes, whatever. And then we'll take Q&A and discussion. So over to you, sir. Thank you.
Well, Usama, thank you very much for inviting me to this event. I have to commend you for your excellent memory to remember a talk after so many years. That's certainly very flattering. And thanks to everyone who's taking out time to listen. I was just speaking earlier to Usama. We're here in the United Kingdom where it's very rainy. I can imagine most of you are in places where it's sunny. So all the more remarkable that you're taking time when the sun is shining to place yourself in front of a screen and listen to my talk. So let me tell you first what got me interested in economics of religion. It's a field that I've been pursuing now for about 15 years. I had always, even before, but I'll skip what went before, I'd been interested in economics and in history. And it was only by coincidence when somebody tipped me off, well, Benedict, were you aware that Muhammad, before he was a prophet, was a merchant? It was only then that it began to cross my mind, well, I wonder whether there's an article that I could get out of investigating this. So that was a good 15 years ago, and here I am since, and I've been expanding my interest in economics of religion. Usama has already introduced the book that came out in 2014, so that's a while ago, and I've been building on that since. That book, by the way, is also done the rounds. It's been traveling. It's translated into several languages, including Arabic and Farsi and Turkish. So that book is around, and I've had an opportunity to engage with adherents to the three Abrahamic faiths on the economics of our respective religions. So what's interesting about economics of religion, and how has my thinking been developing about this? So I don't mean to detain us too long talking about the background, but I think it will simply speed up what I'll say later on. When we speak about religion, we're using an English word, which is inherited from Latin, but we're not using it any longer in the way that the Romans used it. Religio, in the Roman sense, meant to be reverent, tactful, mindful of others, worshipful of parents and divinity. So it encompassed far more than we mean today when we speak of religion. When we think religion, well, that must be something taking place in a building dedicated to worship of God. Religion was, in the Roman sense, something that permeated the way you spent your life and were respectful of others. So that's religion. Before I move on to Islam, let me talk first about economics of religion, because we think economics is a fairly clear concept. It's about supply and demand. It's about intersecting price curves. It's about incentives. But that's not the way the Greeks thought about oikonomia, oikos being house and nomos meaning rules of. Housekeeping applied to houses that were much larger than the individual house. It applied and was expanded and was a concept that applied to the household of the entire universe. And there was a feeling of the Greek philosophers, the Stoic philosophers, that the entire universe was an oikonomia, which was guided by a spirit. So there we are. We have someone who says he's interested in the economics of religion, but from the get-go, you have to say, well, when we talk about economics and when we talk about religion, we're using terms in a different way to the way they were intended when they began. But that's not where the complications end. The complications continue, because when you look at the three Abrahamic religions, where did they come from? Well, they all come from the same geographic area, east of Europe. So we're using terms, economics of religion, which come from Athens and come from Rome, and we apply them to phenomena that originated in the Middle East, in Mecca and in Jerusalem. So we have an incompatibility between the concepts that we use and the area to which they are applied. The Middle East is a completely different culture from Europe, and you can see that in the leading lights that come from the Middle East and from Europe. Greece is famous for producing many philosophers. Rome is famous for producing many lawyers. But neither Greece nor Rome produced prophets. Prophets are an institution, are a personality, are a way of looking at the world that in Europe has not existed. There have never been prophets in European traditions. There are some exceptions. For example, the Mormons, a US originated denomination, their founder, Joseph Smith, considered himself a prophet. He lived in the 1800s. But even allowing for someone such as Joseph Smith and a few others, the history of European cultures and religions is rich with philosophers, lawyers, and theologians, but not with prophets. Prophets are unique to the Middle East. So I'm now getting to the topic, to Islam. Specifically, what was life like in Arabia when Muhammad was born in the 6th century? It was a faraway place. It had a reputation, to be sure, but it had a reputation for being very, very far away, and for being had a reputation for being very clannish, for being standoffish, for doing things their own way, for being resistant to domination by foreign rules or of individual rules. There was no Arabian overlord. it broke down into many, many different constituencies. And the city where Muhammad came from was a city that was already famous. It was famous because it was a destination for worshippers, where they worshipped at the Kaaba, and it was a destination from which originated trade routes. And the town of Mecca, really, you could say the economic and cultural DNA of Mecca was about business and religion. And Muhammad, when he was born into that community. And in that community, he was born into a family that had a network into the world of religion and of business. He was an orphan, as I don't need to tell you his biographic details, but he was reared to be a caravan merchant. He was brought up to follow in the footsteps of his father and of many other of his class to become a long-distance merchant. And he was promoted and set up in his life by his later wife, Khadija, with whom he was married for, I think, 25 years. So he came from a world where before he had his prophetic calling, where he was cut out to follow the role model of many other Meccans of his class and upbringing, to be an expert in commerce. Now, earlier I said prophets are unique to the Middle East. Europeans don't have them. Middle East religions do. Let's just look and compare at the prophet of Islam, Muhammad, and compare him to the prophet of the two other Abrahamic religions, Judaism and Christianity. And I'm comparing him only in respect of their upbringing. Moses was brought up in the household of an Egyptian princess. So he came from a family, or he was brought up in a family that belonged to the social elite in a society that was principally agricultural. The Egyptians were excellent, terrific organizers. We have testimony to their organizational skill even to this day after thousands of years. But they weren't commercially minded. Their economy was based on agriculture. So Moses was somebody who was brought up to think of the economy in terms of agriculture. Let's now fast forward to Jesus. Now, Jesus was brought up in the household of a builder, a carpenter, in a small town. That is quite the opposite end of the social scale to someone like Moses. Jesus was, it's a term that could be considered or sometimes is regarded as pejorative, but the background of Jesus, the business background of Jesus, was small town, lower class, working class. That was his social background. Now let's fast forward again to the Prophet of Islam, and you have a social background and an outlook which is shaped by a family background that is completely different from that of Moses and of Jesus. You've already seen where the differences lie. Moses was interested in agriculture, was upper class. Jesus was working class, and Muhammad was entrepreneurial, middle class by outlook and before they became prophets. Each of them, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, each of them was thrown out of their predictable curriculum vitae by the fact that they became prophets and then began their religions. So I'll leave aside Moses now, I'll leave aside Jesus, and now we'll just look at the business background of Muhammad from the moment onward that he had received his calling to be a prophet. His calling got him into trouble with neighbors, not only with lots of neighbors, but with very important neighbors, especially with the leaders of the business community. They did not object to Muhammad having views about religion because they were, in fact, very, very agnostic about religions. There were many, many denominations which came to Mecca to worship at the Kaaba. What bothered them was the exclusiveness of Muhammad's vision of religion. So sooner or later, Muhammad left Mecca and set up in Medina, where he set up the Ummah. When he was the leader of the expatriates from Mecca in Medina, he took on the important role of being head of a community which now was no longer a private community, but a public community. It turned from an association, a private association, into a social order. And in that sense, irrespective of whether or not he wanted to, he had to express and introduce directives regarding the conduct of business. And unlike Moses, who, when he thought about business, thought about agriculture, unlike Jesus, who, when he thought about work and economics, thought about where he had grown up in a carpenter's shop, Muhammad had been reared in the approaches of the merchant class, of the merchant elite of Mecca. And so I'll give 3 examples how he went about applying his particular expertise. The first example was when he arrived, was soon after he arrived in Medina, he permitted, well, he encouraged setting up an open air market. That open air market might be of interest later on because it's so interesting what all those guidelines were for establishing your stall on that open air market, which in many respects anticipate competition economics, because fairness, which was very important to Muhammad, as it is in every religion, also applied to fairness of competition in the marketplace. But the important thing that I just want to stress right now is that when that market was opened, Muhammad said, let this be your market and let there be no tax on it. So this showed a very clear approach to the government attitudes towards business and conduct of business. When he said, let there be no tax on it, when you hear the word tax, you think, oh, well, so there must have been a government back then, because when we pay taxes today, that's what we do. We pay it to a government. But here, ladies and gentlemen, we have to go back to circumstances being very, very different in Arabia at the time. There was no government in the sense that we apply the term today. It was a market of individuals who congregated, who set themselves rules, but the state was not separate from the individuals who lived and who agreed to live within that community. So there we are. There were dues payable from people who wanted to participate in that marketplace, but they were used for running that marketplace. So that's example number 1, competition and promotion of long-distance trade, because long-distance trade was the business model of the Arabs at the time. The second had to do with government intervention in an area where we see governments intervening all over the world from ever since governments have been set up. At a time when there's a crisis, government intervention in price formation is very important. Why? Well, one of the basic staples in every society is your daily groceries. And your daily groceries are shopped from people who harvested them within the last 12 months, within the harvesting cycle. In a society which is almost exclusively agricultural, whenever there's a famine, whenever there's a bad crop, whenever there's an epidemic, that has a ripple effect which spreads through all markets, but especially through the market for foodstuffs. And people discover very soon that when when there's lack of supply, prices start going up. Famines are a situation where governments intervene. They can do that by rationing goods, or they could do that by price controls. And this is exactly what happened in Medina. Medina is landlocked. It's far from supply routes. And in a famine, the members of the Ummah approached Muhammad and saying, look, there's a huge problem out here. There's a huge distortion in the market because prices for foodstuff have been going up and we can't afford them anymore. So there's lots of dislocation in this market. Please do something about it and cap prices. After all, you are the leader of this community. You can tell from the hadiths that when Muhammad issued his directive, people had a hard time accepting it. The words in the hadiths are that there was some murmuring. Murmuring is a polite term for saying people complained. So the murmuring went on, and Muhammad had to think about it. He withdrew, but then he returned to the community, and then he pronounced something which no other prophet ever had. He said, prices are in the hand of God, which implied it was not within his prophetic remit. Now, I hardly need to tell anyone who's listening now that Muhammad was very clear about introducing measures that he felt were within his remit, and that he did not shy away from taking unpopular measures for that he considered within his duty bound to carry out. So it's highly significant, in my opinion, that he said, price intervention is something that I am not going to get involved in because that is not part of my prophetic mission. That was very significant for the people living at the time, but it's significant even for us to this day. I'll mention that later on, because the fact that he allowed market forces to determine prices, even at a time when market forces were pinching lots of people, set free a market that was a free market society, a free market economy based on long-distance trade. And that had a tremendous ripple effect within Arabia as well as neighboring countries. But more of that later on. The third important measure that Muhammad introduced happened very late in his career. And this is where he was in touch, well, not in touch, but where the contribution was also made by his chief lieutenants, especially Umar ibn Khattab. This was after the integration of Khaybar into the realm of influence and of rule from Medina, where Umar, along with others, received a reward from Muhammad in the shape of lands that were his own. And Umar, who was a man who did not take advantage of privilege, he said, look, I don't need all that much. This is really far more than I can ever use. What am I supposed to do with this? And Muhammad said, well, then think of something so that it comes to the benefit of the poor. And it was around that time, not only through Umar, there were other initiatives that were similar, but his was really the breakthrough moment. This was really a watershed moment. Umar set up a contract, a waqf, W-A-Q-F, and these waqfs were charitable foundations, whereby the goods or the property that was owned personally was vested in the waqf, and the waqf had certain legally certificated requirements for the use of that endowment, which in the case of this particular waqf was for support of the poor. Now, what you have here is something where all of us will say, okay, well, that sounds like social welfare, doesn't it? And I'd say, yes, of course it does. So you might say, well, that's nothing really unusual. I mean, we've got social welfare, and social welfare has always existed in every society. People always had a good heart for people who had fallen on hard times. Why is this so different? It's different for a very important reason, because that is, in fact, one of the glories of the early Islamic culture, because there was a legal framework. There was a set of, not of guidelines, but of clauses. There was a contract between the donor the mutawali, who became the manager, and the beneficiaries. And something like that in this way had never existed before. There had always been people who donated, made donations. For example, as long ago as in ancient Babylonia, made donations to a temple and said, I don't need this particular piece of land. Why don't you use it, harvest it, and make sure it goes to the benefit of the poor? And the priests in ancient Babylonia were just as kind-hearted as priests have been in cultures all around the world. They would have done that. But there was one proviso in there that was missing, and that is that that particular piece of land was ring-fenced from the priests. And over time, people would simply forget about the purpose for which something had been donated, and it became part of the general assets of the temple. When you have a contract, though, and this is what you have in a waqf, things are different because you have incentives. The donor walks away from his endowment once he's made the endowment, so he has to think very carefully, what's this endowment for? Because this is his last chance to influence, to dedicate its purpose. You then have a mutawali who takes over, and his job is to execute the wishes of the donor even after the donor has walked away. And you have the beneficiaries who will look after making sure that they are not neglected or sidelined or bypassed from the use of that endowment. And those beneficiaries, if they felt the mutawali wasn't doing a good job, could go to a judge and sue him for their rights. So the waqf became a legal institution. And providing charity in that way had never before happened. I said earlier I wasn't going to switch back to Moses and Jesus. I think if you will be aware of provisions for social welfare in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, but the important point, I think I've already made that. In Islam, a waqf is different from social welfare in the previous two Abrahamic religions. So these were three ways in which Muhammad introduced measures which derived direct from his experience, decades of experience in business management, and which were not only compatible, but which were an expressive germane to his prophetic mission. And in this way, Islamic economics was profoundly different from the word get-go from Judaic economics and Christian economics. I'll now sidetrack for a moment and look at the ripple effect beyond Islam. At the time that Islam spread in its first few centuries of history, the Muslims brought with them their business practices. Now, just look back at what business was like in the world at the time when the Islamic realm expanded. It was primarily agricultural. The institution of long-distance trade, which had already existed in the Jahiliyyah in pre-Islamic Arabia, that continued, but it came from the Middle East, and those trade practices were then spread to Europe. One of those trade practices was by way of setting up commercial ventures. I'll step aside from that. That's not. I think we can skip that for now. But let me just focus on social welfare. The institution of a waqf was an innovation. There were, by the time Europeans encountered the Muslim world, and by the time Europeans established their own bases in trade colonies as well as in Palestine, they then became aware of the waqf, observed that, and imported that knowledge back home into their own realm. They did that not only with the legal framework, but also with the kinds of institutions that were favored by waqfs. Because the waqfs were endowments, as a rule of thumb, a wealthy Muslim would donate a third of his estate to setting up a waqf. So you can just imagine how, after several centuries, how many diverse approaches there were to pet projects of individuals. But there were two kinds of pet projects where the Islamic realm excelled. One of them was hospitals, another was in education, madrasas. Now, a madrasa, again, you already know this, it's an educational institution built around a mosque. Now, what did Europeans do with this when they heard about, when they discovered this? Well, in the 1200s in England, there was in a new legal framework, a new set of legal requirements, common law, which took on some of the practices of Islam, for example, juries. But another one they established, didn't use the word waqf, but they called them trusts. And a trust, where you have a donor, a trustee, and beneficiaries, is an exact analogy, step by step, to a waqf. But the waqf predates the trust by several centuries. And the purposes of trusts in the 1200s were the same as they were for waqfs and had been for waqfs in the Middle East for several centuries, for education. Now, an educational institution that began in England at that time was the concept of the college. The first ones were in Oxford and in Cambridge. And if you look at the earliest documents of trusts endowing a college in Oxford, the legal requirements and the legal stipulations mirror those of a waqf. So that the earliest Oxford college, by analogy, is a madrasa. But what's changed is you take out a mosque and replace it with a chapel, and what you have is not a madrasa, what you have is an Oxford college. So that was one of the effects, how very early Islamic economics spread. I've come pretty much to the end of what I'd like to say. I'd like to round up because it matters to me to round up with this. That when we and I speak to different communities, and when I say what's really important is that our notions of what we refer to as economics, of what we refer to as religion, are not those that were used by the Greeks and the Romans, who used those terms, who coined those terms. In the Anglosphere and in the Western world generally, religion has narrowed its meaning to apply to relations, typically to institutional life, to relations between humans and the divine. Religion meant much more in the ancient world, including to the ancient pagans. And that sense is much more alive in Islam than it is in Islamic cultures and in the Islamic understanding. And that sense of religion, in the term in which Greeks meant it, oikonomia, is still alive in Islamic culture in ways that is not alive in Western culture, because we think of people who are economic agents, the homo economicus, as being somebody who's not the same thing as somebody the rest of the time. That is not the sense in which ancient Greeks intended oikonomia to be understood. So there we are, ladies and gentlemen. That was my talks. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kerner, for a fascinating summary or just introduction, really. So we have one question in the chat already, but I'm just going to use my chair's privilege and just make several points, actually, and then I have a question for you. So the first, to kick things off. So I should have said at the beginning that Dr. Kerner's book called Early Islam and the Birth of Capitalism, as I wrote to him recently, I've been studying the Quran by the grace of God for pretty much half a century now, including with Sheikh Sohaib Hassan, who's on this call, and many other teachers of the Quran. And I had never understood Surah Quraysh properly, the Ilaf Quraysh, the trade journey of the Quraysh, and the solidarity with Quraysh. Ilaf is quite difficult to translate, but it could mean solidarity. And it's Dr. Kerner's book that explained that to me for the first time. So no Muslim scholar had ever explained really in full what the what Fi Quraysh was all about, really, until I read that book. So, just for that, for those who are interested in the Quran, etc., I would highly recommend that book, Early Son, The Birth of Capitalism, because you will understand hopefully what that is all about. And in a nutshell, it's around the Mudaraba trade model, the trade caravans of up to 3,000 camels loaded with possession with wealth uh, coming together in Mecca, and all of the wealth being noted mentally with all the value and everything. And then رحلة الشتاء والصيف, the trade caravan of the winter and the summer. So in the winter they'd go south towards Yemen, which is right next to Africa, of course. And in the summer they'd go north towards Syria and the Levant. And the solidarity part of what Dr. Kerr talks about is paying off. The Quraysh would pay off the tribes to stop them raiding the caravans, like instead of giving them a percentage of the profits, etc. And so people would trade, in Yemen or in Syria, and the profits would be brought back, and based on a Mudaraba type model where you share the profit according to your investment. This was then all distributed in Mecca. And that was the trade model of the Quraysh, the Prophet's tribe. And it was perhaps perfected under his grandfather, Abdul Muttalib. And as Dr. Curler shows, that modern capitalism is often ascribed to the Venetian of the 16th century, but he showed that they actually copied that from the Quraysh through the Islamic world. That model reached the Europeans. So, it's actually mind-blowing, his book. For those interested in economics, I highly recommend it. Just a quick point. I think, Dr. Kelly, you might be interested to know that in the Islamic tradition, because the Quran says that God sent prophets and messengers to every nation, uh, the divine message is important. There are some Muslim scholars who believe that there were prophets sent to Europe, and they think of some of the philosophers as actual prophets as well. And this is a contested matter, but there are Islamic theologians who believe that Socrates was actually divinely inspired by God, and
Ah, mhm, mhm,
therefore was a prophet
mhm,
of God. And the fact that he was a martyr, he was executed for his teachings. But that for him, philosophy again wasn't confined to the academy, or it
mhm,
was, as I first learned in my first course in philosophy, he used to sit in the marketplace and teach his and teach what he taught through an interactive way. And of course, Aristotle and Plato follow on from Plato, and then Aristotle follow on from him, and the early Muslim philosophers, of course, commented on Plato and Aristotle. And so one of them was known as the second Plato. I think that's Averroes, Ibn Rushd. And another one was known as the second Aristotle, Avicenna, Ibn Sina. So the Islamic culture was very interested in that, and they saw some of them saw it as having a divine origin. Others saw the philosophers as being anti the prophets, because the prophets got direct revelation from God. But there is something called prophetic philosophy.
mhm,
But that's hotly disputed. For example, Ghazali and Ibn Taymiyyah regarded Avicenna as a heretic, whereas the Muslim philosophers regarded him as their great teacher. But that was just a word on prophets, possible prophets of Europe. Oh, and there's also a chapter of the Quran, short chapter called Luqman, Luqman the Wise. Luqman is the epitome of wisdom. And again, Abdullah Yusuf Ali, one of the great translators and commentators on the Quran, he suggested that Luqman is actually the same as Isa, who is the wisdom
mhm.
person in the Greek tradition. And in fact, if you read through the full Aesop's fables, I should just write this up, but there are at least three of the lessons from the fables which are found directly verbatim in the Quran and in the Hadith, which are absolutely verbatim. For example, one of the lessons from Aesop's fables is a hypocrite only deceives himself. And
Ah,
that's on the second or third page of the Quran, actually. It's a famous verse
mhm,
of the Quran. Another one is, if you feel no shame, do as you wish. In the Hadith, the Prophet said, this is one of the earliest teachings of prophethood. So he ascribed this
yep,
teaching himself to the ancient prophets. But
uh-huh.
we find it in Aesop's fables. He could have taken it from earlier sources, of course, but there's a very interesting discussion there. Okay, very quick point on awqaf or waqfs before my question, which is related to it, is that when we visited Egypt, when I visited for the first time in 2008 with the British Foreign Office, actually, one of the scholars at Al-Azhar, Sheikh Al-Azhar, was talking about awqaf waqfs, and he said that before the colonial period, he said we had waqfs or endowments, charitable trusts here for everything.
Mhm.
For example, a waqf for looking after cats or dogs, or if you break something that you're carrying. So rather than insurance or commercial
Mhm.
insurance, he
Mhm.
said you'd go to the appropriate waqf and people would cover the cost of the possession that you've just lost, or to actually look after your cat or dog, including in a veterinary clinic, and of course, never mind hospitals and things which you talked about, and education. And my question there is actually our colleague Muhammad Amin, who we both know from another forum, who is a leading British Muslim thinker, actually, and he's a retired partner from the PricewaterhouseCoopers. He often says that Islamic economics, the jurisprudence, is very well known, and as you said, made great innovations, which the Europeans, the Westerners, copied in many ways. But he says that the Islamic jurisprudence never got to the situation of companies as a separate legal entity. And that's what enabled Western capitalism to kind of take off. But in a sense, held back the Muslim world because they never made that step. But listening to you, actually, I think you're saying that the waqfs were, in a sense, a separate legal entity. But would you agree that so what's happening here? Does that mean the Muslims did this for charitable purposes, but not for like in a waqf, but not for commercial purposes, with the private limited company, for example? Uh, and is therefore the waqf for the possibility from the waqf to a private limited company, but perhaps that step was taken by the West and not by the world of Islam. Over to you, sir.
Oh, you're correct. The purpose of the Waqf is social and it's for charity. It's not a business. It's not a business venture. But there were long distance business ventures, and they came under a different heading of the funduks. These business ventures, and you then switch over to the issue. Well, but those weren't corporations, were they? They weren't a separate legal entity. They did have requirements and duties and requirements and privileges, rights and privileges between the managers of the business venture and the investors. So Khadija, for example, was an investor, and Muhammad was the caravanier who went on the journey. And Islamic law, some of the earliest cases were, for example, over an issue that is very alive now today in the financial sector. When is a bonus payable to a manager? Because and they distinguished very, very carefully between the salary due to the manager, which was independent of the financial success, and the bonus that was due to the manager, which depended very much on business success. As you know, nowadays there are financial institutions which pay a bonus even if there's no profit. That would not wash in early Islam. You had to make a profit to get a bonus. That was a conditioned precedent for making a profit. But your question was about the stagnation of the Islamic business world. This is an issue, Usama, where I have views which differ from many other people. What happened to the Islamic business model happened, and this is just to show you how fast things change, happened within the space of just 5 years. In 1492, Columbus discovered America, and I think it was 1497, Vasco da Gama landed in India. And once that happened, trade switched, had a new market heading across the Atlantic, and trade with India, with the Far East, went by sail around Cape Horn. And from that moment onward, all that trade that went from India to all the way to Venice, which traveled overland, was obsolete. Because from then on, you had two choices of getting your goods from India to Europe. You could go the overland route. Many did. But you could also go the sea route, and many did that. And from that moment on, you were no longer in a position where you were in control of trade routes. And it is from that moment on that Islamic economics started to suffer. Now, you'll say, okay, Benedict, but it's got to have something to do with religion too, doesn't it? However, Usama, then I'll say, fine, I've got the counterfactual for you. Because Venice also did its trade with the Middle East, not with the colonies in the United States, in the Americas, and they were not in control of the sea lanes around Africa. And what happened to business in Venice from the 1500s onward? It declined. And the Venetians were many things, but one thing they were not was Muslim. So therefore, when your trade route has disappeared, your business model has disappeared. And when your business model has disappeared, it doesn't matter whether you're Muslim or Christian, your business model is gone. So it's the discovery of trade that was seaborne rather than landborne, that was maritime rather than terrestrial. That explains why Islamic economics declined. That's my explanation. You won't hear that very often. I'm not the only person who has pointed this out, but it's a minority opinion. But I thought I would mention it.
Now, thank you very much for that, Dr. Kurla. As Dr. Jilali Abdulaziz has pointed out in the chat, the historian, especially of Islamic and Arabic science, George Saliba, he makes the same argument for the decline of Islamic science, actually.
Okay. I was unaware of that.
Yeah, no, he makes that point. I remember in his books, but also I attended a lecture at SOAS, again, about 10, 12 years ago, where he made precisely that point. The Islamic world, again, declined because of the trade route, because science, until today, well, even today, needs patronage, right? Loads of money. And so science in the medieval period in the Muslim and Christian worlds was done by scientists who had usually royal patronage and funding. And it's still the case today with the current president of the US cutting a lot of the science funding. Science is in trouble. So thank you for that answer, though. Just a couple of comments also from the chat before I come back to Dr. Jilali's earlier question. But while we're on this subject, I'll just stick to the comments on the subject here. But by the way, if you want to ask a question in person, please put your hand up and I can come to you and unmute you or put them in the chat. So Sajjad Chaudhry says that besides the issue of companies, there are other issues our tradition does not necessarily cover. There's just a comment there. Here's a question from Rashad. He's asking, was Muhammad Amin referring to the nature of the joint stock company as a phenomenon that could pool capital in large amounts for substantial investments, as a specific issue that was related to a model that has in contemporary times changed the dynamic in more recent times, as opposed to very real material factors too, which, as you know, which are, as you showed, really significant. And he says, Professor Jim Al-Khalili makes some really interesting material and scientific inventions too. So the question is about the joint stock company enabling the pooling of capital in large amounts for substantial investments. But that was happening with the Quraysh and the trade caravans, right?
Yes. Well, I'm not as convinced as are many others that the corporation was the deal maker for the Western world. Allow me to point out there have been many family companies which are very successful to this day. I don't think anybody can claim the House of Rothschild or the House of Schroders are insignificant. They're family companies. The majority of U.S. business in the United States, the majority of businesses are family owned. I've been retired now for a good long time, but I remember for a large part of my working life, Goldman Sachs was a partnership. It wasn't a corporation. That was a development that's happened over the last few decades. I am interested, though, as I'm interested in business history and business institutions, when corporate liability, limited liability companies were legislated here in this country where I live, in the United Kingdom, and where I have lived in Germany, they were very controversial, and they were objected to amongst other groups by the Christian churches. And because the corporation is a form of business which limits responsibility for your personal action. If you're in a partnership, you're liable for the consequences. If you're a shareholder, you're only liable for the amount that you put in, which means that there's a difference in incentive between you as a shareholder and you as opposed to being a partner. And there's a difference in incentives between a manager of a family company and the manager of a corporate company. The larger the corporation, the more diffuse the number of people. They aren't even wholly responsible anyway, to whom you are accountable. This was pointed out in the second half of the 1800s by many clerics, Christian clerics. They were saying, this is not the Christian approach to taking responsibility, because if you're a Christian, you're supposed to be responsible for your actions. If you're manager of a corporation, you have this enormous tool, but you're not responsible for what happens to it. But that is just by the by. But it's absolutely correct. There is that view about the emergence of the corporation as being the great secret sauce of the Western world. And there is a highly regarded professor on this, Timur Kuran, who's Kuran, who wrote a best-selling book, very rare if you're a business economist, called The Long Divergence. And if you're interested, I point you to that book, and you could not find a better argued advocate of that particular school of thought.
Thank you, Dr. Kerner. The sorry, I just lost my train. Oh, I was just going to say that actually it's very interesting to hear what you said about the Christian clerics' response in the 19th century, because we have similar responses from some Muslim clerics today, actually, to that, who say that the corporation, precisely because it wasn't developed in Islamic jurisprudence, they say it's not part of the tradition, and they point out the same ethical or moral problems with it around responsibility.
Very interesting to hear that. Very interesting to hear that. Mhm.
Yeah, yeah. So I know Muslims who won't invest in the stock exchange, for example, for that, because they actually believe that the stocks and shares model is actually is fundamentally taking away that responsibility, and you should invest directly in businesses,
Very
especially.
good.
And as you know, actually, it's the same. What you said about the US is true of the UK as well. The vast majority of businesses are family businesses. Right. Okay. A related question actually is because you've written about capitalism, and I should have mentioned, I think you've written a number of books in German as well, including about one of the founders of Deutsche Bank. But there is, of course, modern capitalism, because you ascribe the birth of capitalism actually to early Islam and the Quraysh, and that's and your arguments are very convincing, and that is an an issue of kind of, if you like, pride in a good way for the Islamic and Arab tradition. But there is, of course, problems with modern capitalism. So people might describe it as usurious capitalism, and you've written about the whole issue of usury is a major issue in the three Abrahamic religions and beyond, actually. The Hindus and the Greek and Roman philosophers as well talked about that. It could be seen as exploitative. And what do you think is, how do you feel we can fix some of those problems? So, for example, I've heard the terms ethical capitalism, but also stewardship capitalism, which I heard from a Christian economist on this. Do you have any particular views on that?
Usama, I do have views on that, but I'm an author. I always stick to my knitting. My expertise is about Abrahamic religions in antiquity and the Middle Ages. I never get involved in contemporary issues because there are other people who know that. What I do, my competitive strength is in the ideas, the concepts at the time. I never give policy prescriptions. I don't give. I have opinions on both things, but. I know economists generally think if they know one thing about economics, they probably know everything about, well, some economists do. So I always make it clear, this is what I'm good at is historical economics. So I don't give policy prescriptions. But you would find the idea of stewardship capitalism is more pronounced with family companies than with corporate companies, where you have this whole chain it becomes very confusing where the incentives actually lie. And there's lots of new thinking about corporate governance, and I'm not up to date on it. It's not my job. It's not my job. It's not something where I go. I'll tell you though, there's something that I find very interesting. If you're talking about corporate governance, corporate management, and business ethics, it's the concept of risk. Now, risk is a concept that is everywhere in business management, and risk management is a concept that's very popular and that lots of people write about. But risk management, Usama, I'm inclined to think it's a contradiction in terms. Risk is the thing that you can't manage. And you'll figure that out if you look at the term risk, because it's not, in fact, a European Latin word. I always thought risk, because it sounds like risico in Italian, you'd think it comes from the Romans. In fact, the Romans did not have a word for risk. Neither did the Greeks. They had words for luck, danger, fate, but they didn't have a word for risk. Now, so you'll ask me, well, hang on, so how come you know the word? Well, I know the word because it's been circulating in European business contracts from around, guess when? The 1200s, when Europeans started picking up ideas from Islam, such as the waqf, such as the funduks, and they put it in their contracts. The Italian merchants who were doing these joint ventures for trade had contracts ad risicum et fortunam, and the word risk comes from an Arabic word, rizq. And the Arabic word rizq has a wide range of connotations. It means, it can mean very good things happening, or it can mean very untoward things happening. But the notion of the unpredictability of contingencies, that the word that's contained in risk, that is Arabic. And Europeans picked it up from their business partners in the Middle East. We live in a world where unpredictable things happen all the time, and where people say, well, that's a black swan event, or it's a low probability, high impact event. All of those terms that we now come to terms with, or that we try to capture by using sophisticated mathematical models. Hey, it was already there when the word started, but we forgot what it meant when it started. And the word and where it comes from is from Arabia. Not only from I think it's in the Quran, but it's not only in the Quran. It's germane to the business culture of the ancient Arabic world. So I just wanted to mention that.
No, thank you for that, Dr. Keller. That's one of the many priceless nuggets, actually, which I found in your book on Islam and capitalism, that the word risk comes from the Arabic word rizq, which, as you said, is in the Quran, it basically means sustenance in its widest meaning. So food, drink, but also spiritual sustenance, material and spiritual. And in fact, one of the names of God, as you'll know, God has an infinite number of names. The names of God, the tradition is found in all religions. And in the Islamic tradition, it is said that there are 99 names revealed in the Quran itself. They're known as the most beautiful names of God. And one of them is Ar-Raziq or Ar-Razzaq, the one who provides sustenance. So it's all in the hands of God. Which reminds me, could you say a bit more about the link between the second key contribution of the Prophet Muhammad that you mentioned, which was about saying prices are in the hands of God, and Adam Smith's famous statement that about the invisible hand behind the market? Because I think you make that link in your book.
Well, this notion of Muhammad. This was one of the aspects. Even if Muhammad had not been a prophet, he would be a historical figure of world importance, because he was the first supply-side economist in world history. It was perfectly normal. It was generally thought a core competency of a government to fix prices, especially for groceries, even at times when there was no shortage, when there was no famine. In the Middle Ages, the House of Commons would determine the price of bread. It was quite common throughout Europe until a few centuries ago. There could be what were called bread riots, because people disagreed with the fixed price of bread. There were guilds, and the guild set the price for for goods, for example, for bread. And the guilds were regulated of the price they would charge. You may have, well, if you don't live in England, you would not have heard of this. And there's the term the baker's dozen. A baker's dozen is the number 13. Now, the baker's dozen comes from a medieval tradition whereby bakers would have to be very, very careful about selling bread because it had to be a certain weight. And when it was underweight, they would be reprimanded by the guild to which they belonged, which is why those bakers who were worried that their customers would take them to task and say, you're selling me bread for the fixed price, but it's not the amount of bread that I think I'm buying, just to make sure they weren't underselling, they would add another loaf. And that's why if you bought 12 loaves of bread, you added another one, which is why erring on the side of caution was providing a baker's dozen. So regulating fixing prices was not unusual. It was, in fact, quite the norm. So when somebody like Adam Smith, writing in the 1700s, would speak about incentives and that it was a good idea for for the butchers, the bakers, the candlestick makers, to try as hard as they can to make a profit because that was all to the good, he was saying something that we now understand and take for granted. Of course, butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers want to make money. When Adam Smith was writing this, it's in his Wealth of Nations, that was unconventional, which is one of the reasons why we like to think of Adam Smith, quite correctly, as a groundbreaking economist. But when you think of it, well, Mohammed already said that a lot earlier back in Medina, only he was not regarded as an economist. He says, this is simply part of my outlook. This is my way of life. But quite a lot of classical economics is anticipated by these very guidelines that Muhammad legislated in Medina. He promoted long-distance trade. He de-restricted. He reduced taxes. He abolished the tax on the market. He said price formation should be left to supply and demand and not to a public authority, let alone to somebody who's in a position of power. And he also introduced, and that is something that the liberal economies and economists are held to task for, being unfeeling to people who do not succeed in the business world. He also introduced provision of welfare, albeit not by government, but by personal initiative through the means of the waqf. So the whole package of liberal economics is already contained in the economy of Medina of the 7th century.
Thank you, Dr. Kerr. There are, of course, many economic teachings of the Prophet. One of my favorite ones around the market is that when the Prophet taught that if a Bedouin comes from the desert, bringing whatever good he has to sell in the market, then it is forbidden for somebody from the city to actually intercept him
Yep.
and try to do a trade deal with him because he doesn't know the prices in the market. You said you must let him come to the market and get a fair price for his good. And there are many, many teachings like that. And of course, many books have been written on that. Could
Yeah,
you?
Usama, this is all about insider trading because he wanted a business transaction. That's why the open air market was important. Everybody in the marketplace had a look in when you were doing business. He didn't want things done off market. This is exactly the guideline that you have for disclosure of price competition. It's all there in the teachings of the time, Usama. Yep.
Thank you for that. Could you explain what funduks were in the medieval times? Because of course the modern funduk is a hotel, a commercial place where you pay for your rent. But how did the funduk start?
Well, the funduks, it's another interesting development how things change over time. We think of a funduk now as a hotel. It did provide lodging, but for a very particular kind of person, for a long-distance merchant. This is how they began, was that back in the days before Islam spread all over the Middle East, the prevailing authority was a Roman Empire, albeit not a Roman Empire based in Rome, but one that had its capital in Constantinople. And that empire, that Byzantine Empire, also extended all the way to Italy. And in Italy, there were small towns such as Amalfi, such as Venice, such as Genoa, and they lived exactly the way their colleagues and competitors in Mecca lived. They lived by, but not by going across deserts, but by sailing across the sea. They were long distance merchants. Now, the Byzantine Empire had its internal trade market, only it wasn't across the sands of Arabia, it was across the seas between eastern and western Mediterranean. So they allowed their subjects from Venice, just to pick an example, but I've already mentioned the other ones, such as Amalfi and Genoa. Just stick to the Venetians. The Venetians were allowed to set up their trade depot in all over the Byzantine realm. For example, in Damietta, in Alexandria, in Egypt, and in other places all along the coasts of the Mediterranean, wherever you could dock. Now, that business model was fine. The Byzantine Empire had the officials running it from Constantinople, and you had business people from Italy who supplied merchandise and supplied the trade routes throughout that empire. It's comparable to the British Empire and Hong Kong in the 1800s. You had a thriving trade depot in the Far East, which was pretty much self-managed, but it was under the oversight of a government in faraway London. So there you had these Italian merchants, and they lived in, the term for it at the time in Greek was pandocheion. Now the pandocheia were operating even at the time that the Byzantine Empire was ousted from the Middle East. But when the new overlords came to rule the Middle East, they found these pandocheia and Italian merchants there who were not military enemies, but were in fact business partners known to them already. So they said, look it, why don't you just stay here? So what you had all over the Islamic realm, in harbor towns and in anywhere where trade was conducted between East and West, you had these pandocheia, shortened to pandoch, and eventually to funduk, where you were, they were walled. They just like hotels do now. They were enclaves where merchants would settle, and they had enough space to bring their wares, and they traded with their neighbors. They were what today we would call an offshore trading center. Offshore trading center because they had their own fiscal regulations, guidelines, and laws. And so they were respected as expatriates who had their own guidelines, and they were ring-fenced, literally ring-fenced, because they were in walled community. They were inside a wall, and they had to be there at night. By nightfall, the gates were closed, so they were locked in, but they locked out everybody else. That was for security reasons. And they operated for centuries and centuries. But the notion of an offshore trade center existed, and of a coexisting Islamic economy and hinterland around you with funduks, where you had Europeans trading selling their wares and buying in their goods, existed and continued and transitioned from the Byzantine Empire to the Islamic Empire.
Thank you so much for that. And again, you mentioned that in your book briefly, the one on Islam and capitalism, which again I highly recommend reading for anybody interested in this. Oh, and I have to say, my favorite nugget, which I wrote to Dr. Kerr about last night, actually, was that when he talks about the trade around the Mediterranean, which was obviously the Venetians were well placed for that. But in later history after that, the Mediterranean was known as an Ottoman lake because the Ottomans ruled nearly all around it. But there was a lot of migration actually or some migration between the Islamic and European worlds there for trade. But one of the examples, which I think you mentioned, is the great Italian mathematician Fibonacci, grew up in modern day Algeria and actually was learnt about the Islamic and Arabic tradition of mathematics there. And Fibonacci numbers we all learn about in primary school, and they they are central to the DNA and spiral structures and the golden ratio and all the rest of it. Uh, so Fibonacci, but the other one you mentioned was the name Mussolini in Italy.
Mhm.
Mussolini's ancestors, that name comes from Al-Mosuliyun. So Mussolini's ancestors, that family name came from traders who came from Mosul in Iraq. So they may have been Muslim or Christian, we're not sure, but they were certainly Arab Iraqis who came
Mhm.
and settled in Italy. And so they were known as the Mosuliyin, the,
Mhm.
uh, the people from Mosul. And that family name, which is normally in Arabic or, the title, giving your geographical origin, was eventually Italianized to Mussolini. And I was just mentioning that some of the work I do is around counter extremism in the UK. And I recently talked to a neo-Nazi, actually, a young white man in the UK, who who believes that the white race is superior to others, and he said all non-whites are subhuman. He said that to my face, and therefore definitely brown people, Arabs, Muslims, Jews, blacks, were all subhuman. And he said the white race is under attack worldwide, and violence is justified to defend and promote the white race. He also said that the British Empire was so great it should have carried on and ruled over the whole world, and we should bring the British Empire back and rule the whole world because we were the best at running things. So I said to him, hold on, you've just contradicted yourself because the, you're espousing Nazi views and fascist views. And I mentioned Hitler and Mussolini, and he said, oh, the good guys. But I said, hold on, the British Empire actually fought Hitler and Mussolini and the fascism,
Mhm.
which you are actually espousing. And then I told him, and I'd learned this from your book, that, well, Mussolini is one of your heroes, but his ancestors were Arab and possibly Muslim, and they came from Mosul in Iraq. So where does that leave you, your hero? And of course, he was completely gobsmacked. He had no answer to that.
Mhm.
It just looked at me. So that was one of the many nuggets in your book, wh-
Mhm.
which I
Yeah, it must be very difficult doing your work. I mean, that must be very. I'm glad you were able to counter that particular interlocutor, but it must be very dispiriting to. So hats off for you to doing that work. It's not an easy, certainly not an easy task. No, I've
Thank you, Dr. Kelly. There is a question which is probably one for the Muslim scholars or an internal question, but I'll just read it out because Dr. Jilali has put it in the chat. Well, actually, I think Dr. Kelly, you might have a view on this, and we only have a few minutes left, or whenever you'd like to end. Dr. Jilali asks, considering the Prophet Muhammad's, peace be upon him, his demonstrated expertise in trade and market practices, how should we understand the traditional description of him as ummi, meaning unlettered? So in terms of perhaps not being
uh,
someone who was into reading and writing, but Ummi also means having a strong oral culture and a mental using the mental capacity which the Arabs actually, not only the Prophet, but the Arabs, the Quraysh, are described in general, the Arabs in general, as Ummi, people who are not primarily into reading and writing, but who are based on an oral tradition, although the first revelation of the Quran is read or recite, Iqra.
yeah.
But how do you see? I think you mentioned in your book that all of the calculations for up to 3,000 camels in a trade caravan were done in people's heads, basically, or they would have written a little bit down as well.
I
Just
think they were it's another Usama, it's another when we speak of literature, because it's got the Latin word litera, which means letter, as in something, as in writing. We think literature is always in writing, and then we speak of oral literature as if it were a subset. I think the Arabs were tremendously literate in the sense that they had a tremendous grasp of literature in the sense of literary tradition and literary culture. Earlier on, you mentioned, I was very surprised, it was completely new, that there was one of Aesop's fables found its way into Arabic literature and into the Quran. I'm aware that Muhammad was a tremendously literate person. I mean, he gave awards to the people who were poets. I forget the lady's name. He grew up in the Kaaba. They had the Mu'alakat, they had these poetry competitions when they had their fairs before they had the the Hajj, the Arabs would get together and there were poetry competitions. But of course, what they called these, they had a very, very rich, very long culture of poetry competitions. By the way, the mu'alakat, I've read them. They're highly regarded in the history of poetry. And one of the first people in Europe to point out the literary merit of Arabic mu'alakat was a German poet, Goethe. He wrote quite this, and he wrote about this. He was a revolutionary in his own way too, but he was writing about this, I think, in the 1790s or early 1800s, at a time when hardly anybody had been reading mu'alakat. But he pointed it out then. If you go to the British Library, look up mu'alakat, you'd be amazed at the people who have translated them. They are highly appreciated. But your question was specifically, was Muhammad unlettered? It's quite possible that he didn't know how to write, but not knowing how to write doesn't mean you weren't literate. I think he was a very, very he knew. Look at all the traditions which flow into the Islamic culture of the time. Highly unlikely, and especially think of all the people that he was dealing with and who he interacted with. No, the Arabs had a terrific network. If you're not very well informed, how can you be a long distance trader? Highly unlikely. And I think we underestimate the ability of people to remember it simply because we have these smartphones and we keep looking things up every 3 minutes. Before they had smartphones, before they had books, people had tremendous memories. They didn't have all this garbage that they stuffed their head with. They didn't have technology. The ancient Greek, Plato, I thought it's in Plato somewhere, where somebody talks about the invention of writing, says it's going to make people dumber because they don't have to remember things. We have no idea. I read a lot of medieval documents, and I just cannot imagine that all the people writing in the Middle Ages had research assistants. So when they are quoting this chapter, this gospel, that gospel, how did they do that? The concentration that they had in their mind, the ability to focus was tremendous. No, I don't think he was illiterate. I'm not familiar with the word ummi, but I think Muhammad was quite the opposite. I also thought the word surah, I read somewhere, doesn't that have a Latin derivation? I read somewhere, but this has been a long time ago, that whether or not he knew Latin. But I forget where that. I remember the biography. It was in a spellbinding biography, written also in the 1800s, Alois Sprenger. But he spoke about the etymology of lots of Arabic terms that came into circulation in early Islam, which came from other cultures. Yeah, so that's my view on literacy of the early Arabs.
Thank you. There is well, just a comment on that, which is that one of the beauties of the Islamic tradition is it has preserved the tradition of memorization. So especially amongst the religious scholars, you're expected to memorize the entire Quran in Arabic, and
Yeah, correct. Yeah, yeah.
every imam has done that. But it's not just the Quran. The greatest scholars, within living memory, Sheikh Shanqiti, for example, Sheikh Suhaib's the main Quran teacher. Basically, they would memorize the entire library,
Yeah,
and
yes.
and yes, we'd be able to recall, as you said, exact quote verbatim. Ibn Taymiyyah wrote his reply to Greek logic in prison, entirely from memory.
Mhm.
While Hallaq has translated that into English, and that is a tradition actually, which the millions of Muslim children, men and women actually, who memorize the entire Quran. I have two female cousins and two female nieces, who have memorized the entire Quran in Arabic, for example.
Mhm.
And that capacity of the human memory, it is absolutely phenomenal. Uh,
There used to be, I mean, the early Arabs had a bias against writing. They thought testimony had to be, that's why you had these chains and they had this A told B, who told C, who told D, because if it wasn't transmitted orally, they said, well, anybody can put down anything on a piece of paper. Because it's when you're looking someone in the eye when you talk to them, that's when you are really speaking in a reliable way. And it's much harder to manipulate the truth when you're speaking than when you're writing.
Related to that, our colleague from Saudi Arabia has posted, just reminded us that the longest verse in the Quran, which is over a page long, just one verse, is known as Ayatul Dain, the verse about debt. And it's about writing down debt, financial debt transactions with two witnesses, which is very good advice. Actually, there was I took a loan a couple of years ago from a friend actually, and we forgot to write it down. Nowadays, I think you can just do that in an email and CC in two witnesses at the minimum, because he asked for the money back a couple of years later, and I'd forgotten that loan that actually taken out that loan from him, and I thought it hadn't gone through because there was some uncertainty at the time as to whether or not he was able to lend me that money or not. And I said, yeah, I basically said, no, bro, that never happened. You never lent me that money. But luckily, he had a record of it in his bank account. He sent me. He said, "Yes, I did. Here it is." And luckily, I had the money to pay him back immediately. But I remember thinking, really, next time I really will actually follow the Quranic advice, which is to write down debt with two witnesses, and the person who is the debtor is the one who should dictate the right, so that they're not exploited. But then an exception is made at the end of that verse for day-to-day transactions. If it's a day-to-day transaction, you don't need to write it down.
Uh-huh.
I remember once I bought a car from a friend actually for about £1,500, and he was very rich, and I didn't have the money to pay in one go, and I said just pay in installments. But I said, do we need to write this down and have two witnesses, or is this a day-to-day transaction?
Uh-huh.
For me, it wasn't, but my friend was very rich and he said, oh, this is a day-to-day transaction for me. So we didn't write that down. So you get the idea of this kind of thing happening. But I think our time is up really. We could continue forever. Thank you thank you to everybody who's joined and who's contributed in the chat, and especially to our honored guest, Dr. Benedict Kerner. And I will actually leave the final word to you. We have 2 minutes left. If there are any closing remarks you'd like to make, it's been a real honor to have you, sir, at the Al Quran Society Weekly Circle. Thank you.
Well, all I can say is that I cannot think of a better way to spend a rainy Sunday afternoon than meeting with your good selves. Thanks to all of you and for the hospitality which you have extended. And Usama, thanks to you for going to all the trouble of taking this initiative and reaching out to so many people. And I feel for you in the work that you do. And I can imagine there must be times when it's dispiriting living in this country and doing the work that you do. So hats off and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ben. Well, hats off. There we go. All right. Okay. Until next time, everybody, may the peace, mercy, and blessings of God be upon all of us. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you very much.